Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this last panel of the workshop on research and writing in the post-Westphalian order. This panel is called Political Dimensions of Translation, and we want to look at three questions. Can translation live up to the expectation of acting as a mediator between cultures? How do literary translators deal with the traces of orientalist and colonialist thinking in classics? And to what extent is translation itself related to colonialism? We will explore these questions in this panel together with the writer, translator, and lecturer Monika Rinck, joining us from Vienna. With the philosopher, one might call him, with Şahin Kürküt. He studied philosophy. He is also a teacher for the Kurdish language and a translator. He translates from German to Kurdish. And with Dr. Johannes Salim Ismaiel-Wendt, professor for sociology of music and popular music studies at the University of Hildesheim. My name is Larissa, and I'm a literature translator of Arabic into German and a lecturer in Arabic. I'm going to start with a short introduction. After that, we prepared three inputs, like in the last panel. And before the inputs, I'm going to introduce the speakers briefly. In 2020, in the German book market, there were about 9,164 translations, so 30.2% of the first editions. 63.1% of them were translated from English, and then only 10.6% from French and 10% from Japanese mangas, for example, mainly. Other languages were led by Italian with 2.4%. Languages of the Oriental language area, such as Arabic, Turkish, Persian, or Kurdish, aren't even mentioned in these statistics. What is interesting, however, is the other side, the licensing of German titles abroad. China has the largest share of 20.3%, followed by Turkey with 8.1%, and then Russia with 7.4%. China, Turkey, Russia. Three states with an internal structure that holds considerable potential for political conflict, possibly also with regard to translations. In this respect, the question whether translations per se serve to build bridges to other cultures is justified, whether they foster mutual understanding, and assuming that this is the case, is every translation per se good, simply because the transfer from one language to another leads to a change of perspective that perhaps even promotes the cohesion of culture and thus of the world? And in what space does translation actually take place? Even if translators are only too happy to evoke the image of their life spent in a lonely study, they quite often enter into fields of political tension that may influence the translation in terms of choice of words, attitude, and style. But in the worst case, it can also lead to them being killed for doing their work, as happened to Hitoshi Igarashi, the Japanese translator of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, who was killed on the 11th of July 1991 as a result of Khomeini's fatwa against the author, Rushdie, and all his supporters. The Italian translator of the Satanic Verses narrowly survived an assassination attempt. The last politically charged discussion about the work of translators took place in Europe at the beginning of the year, when the U.S. poet Amanda Gorman read her poem, The Hill We Climb, at the inauguration of U.S. President Joe Biden. The poem was quickly translated into several European languages. In the discussion that followed the choice of the translator into Dutch, Marieke Lucas-Reinfeldt, who subsequently resigned the commission, and the question of who was actually suitable to translate certain texts or poems became a very urgent one. The activist Janice Doyle, who had sparked the protest through an article in the Volkskrant, had questioned why a translator, in this case Marieke Lucas-Reinfeldt, no experience of an identity as a black woman and no experience in spoken word art had been chosen. Suddenly it was questioned who was actually allowed to translate what, and whether a certain identity or affiliation of the translator was a prerequisite for the ability to empathize with other people of their identities or affiliations. The Creoles was withdrawn from the assignment because, he said, he didn't, or it was said, he did not have the right profile as he was white and 60 years old. By the way, he had finished translating the poem at that point. The debate was extremely heated, and the repercussions are still strongly felt in translator circles today. This discussion also seamlessly fit in with the very urgent discussions on how to deal with certain terminology previously adopted without thought that degrades the dignity of other people, regardless of their identity. For example, class, race, gender, hashtag #MeToo, or we too. This has partly undermined society's own self-image, but also that of translators who for many decades and centuries moved thoughtlessly in the bubbles of their own culture. Most translators have accepted the challenge and come out in the open with their reflections, which is also the case here in this workshop. They discuss and question their own handling of their language and look for solutions in exchange with others. The question is, for example, how we can literally integrate the term people of color into a novel. We still don't have a literal language for certain terms. So translation seems to be politically. But does it really play a mediating role between cultures? Or does translation, on the contrary, promote colonialism? And what function has translation taken on in the times of colonialism and post-colonialism? Can translation be neutral? Maybe more than ever before. Why are there so many new translations in German? By the way, Edward Said's book Orientalism also underwent a new translation in 2009 by Hans-Günther Holl, who, however, calls the term Islamic scholar Islamists. That's how he translated that term. And how do translators from German into other languages relate to texts from colonial times and the associated longing for the Orient that many European artists and writers felt or believed they had? How should such Orientalisms, and here we come full circle to the work Sounds from the Orient by Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, be transmitted and translated? Do we always need a critical way of commenting artworks because dealing with language has become more sensitive and it's full of traps? I would like to ask Monika Rinck to start with her presentation, to start with her input. Monika Rinck lives and works in Berlin and in Vienna. Like I said, she's joining us virtually from Vienna. Together with Ursula Kalla, she translates from the Hungarian language, she cooperates with musicians, and she teaches in Vienna at the University of Applied Arts. She published multiple books, poems, a book with lectures that is called Wirksame Fiktionen. In 2020, she gave a lecture on the title Vorhersagen, Poesie and Prognose. And for the Trans Droste project, Monika Rinck, together with Annie Rutherford, Shane Anderson and Daniel Falb, translates the Droste texts from Westphalia, as we heard in the last panel. And in the second part of the project, she's going to translate the poem cycle Sounds from the Orient. She was awarded multiple awards. I just want to name two. This year in 2021, she received the Berlin Literature Prize Award. And together with the translator Ursula Kalla, she received the Erlanger Literatur Award for poetry as a translation, and in the winter of 2021, a new edition of the so-called Begriffsstudio 1 bis 5000 will be published with new comments, new poems, new essays. Maybe you could just quickly talk a little bit about what a Begriffsstudio 1 bis 5000 means. Monika Rinck, please. The Begriffsstudio, the studio of understanding, that's a bit irritating. Sorry, I can't see myself speak. Okay, you can hear me. So this studio of terminology, of understanding, is a collection of terms in different languages. Some of them were generated by translation mistakes, and I've been collecting these terms, and now I am going to publish them. Spectre Books is the publisher. And I think they can also be found online, right? Exactly. The terms 1 to 5,000, so from 1,000 onwards, they are all online, but the comments are partly only in the book. Oh, we're very much looking forward to your input. Yes, okay, so many questions. And I'm quite intimidated because I won't be able to answer all those questions. Only a tiny fragment of the questions will be answered. I think the contextualization of terms, of languages, that is something that we should really focus on. Because you don't just translate a term, you translate a term in a certain era, in a certain time, in a constellation, and with a meaning at the beginning. So the inauguration would have had to be translated as well. We are looking at very specific poetry, and that makes the whole field even more complicated. When I talk about Orientalism, I think of a historical term, something that in the 19th century was transformed again and again. But if we look at the presence, the discussion about fundamentalist Islamism could also be referred to as a sort of Orientalism. So it's a very diverse term that also has its own counter terms, and they are also existent. So how can I deal, or how can I become aware of those insecurities when it comes to translation? Can it even be an advantage when a term is very vague, an insecure term that isn't really defined in a rigid way when I use it? And the same applies to political processes that I think sometimes carry translation conflicts within them. When I think of negative qualities like insecurity, panic, fear, that once talked about an alienation from wage work, changing ourselves, reinventing ourselves, that is a possibility that people have. Then we once again find terms that are between euphemisms and dysphemisms. At the same time, I never have the full control over the semantics of my own terms in just one language. But when I want to speak, I have to accept that. I can say no to wrong translations by philologically analyzing them, by talking to other translators, by, for example, stopping a process and saying, hang on, we're looking at a different term here, you misunderstood it, we have to rethink what is going on.
Und da auf Präzision zu setzen, ist natürlich auch ein politischer Impuls.
So that is an impulse.
Auf der anderen Seite haben wir
On the other hand,
enorm viele Formen der
we have
manipulativen
many
Aneignung,
forms of manipulative appropriation,
absichtlichen oder
willful
unabsichtlichen
or maybe accidental appropriation,
Falschübersetzung
or
und diese
wrong
unabsichtliche oder
translations, so
absichtliche
willful or
Fehlübersetzung
accidental
kann natürlich auch eine Form der
mistakes
Begeisterung
in
sein.
translations. That can
Deutscher
also be a
Hip-Hop
form
zum
of
Beispiel, eine
enthusiasm.
entsetzliche
German hip-hop, for
Fehlübersetzung,
example, is a
aber
horrible
letztlich irgendwie,
mistranslation.
gut, das will ich jetzt nicht
But
weiter beurteilen,
well,
aber
I don't want to
sozusagen im kulturpopulären
judge
Bereich
that.
kommt es
But
natürlich immer
in
wieder
pop
zu
culture,
Aneignung.
again and again,
Das ist für mich auch ein
appropriation
Punkt, den ich
happens,
wichtig finde,
and
auf den
that's
der
a point
Literaturwissenschaftler Christian Metz
to me,
hingewiesen
where
hat
the
im
literary
Zusammenhang
scientist
mit der
Christian
Übersetzungsdebatte.
Metz talked
Es
about
ändert sich,
when it
wenn
comes to the debate about
ein
translation.
Text zur Ware
If
wird.
a
Es ändert sich
text
dann, wenn die Sache
becomes
weiterverkauft wird, wo
a
man sich
traded
dann fragen
good,
muss,
it
wer verdient
changes.
jetzt
If a text is
eigentlich
sold on,
daran?
if
Und
you have to
dann
ask
gehört
yourself
eben auch
who
dies
is making money with
zu
this
dem
text, then
Kontext
it
der
changes.
Übersetzung.
And that is also part of translation.
Mit der gewissen Überraschung, dass die deutsche Übersetzung dann bei Hoffmann und Kamper erschienen ist und
And it's a
lange
bit
Zeit
surprising
Hälfte
that the
der
German
Seite
translation was published at
aufgerufen hat,
Hoffmann and
direkt als
Kampe.
Spitzentitel
And when
neben
you
der
opened
Kandidatin stand.
the
Das
website,
versetzt einem dann doch so einen leichten Schauer.
my work was right next to the candidate. And that sent shivers down my
Angeregt durch die
spine.
Fragen habe ich mich jetzt etwas von meinem Skript
So
entfernt, aber
I
ich konnte so viele
listen to your
Fragen
questions,
ganz unbeantwortet
and
stehen
I
lassen.
am
Oder
not
zumindest
just reading out my script
versucht,
anymore
sie ein
because
wenig
I
anzureißen.
want to touch on the many questions that you
Der,
mentioned.
der deutsch-indische Germanist Anil Bhatti hat darauf
Anil
hingewiesen,
Bhatti already
dass
pointed out the following thing.
der Versuch, etwas ganz genau zu verstehen,
They said that if you attempt to understand
häufig
something
auch eine Form von
exactly,
Aneignung sein
that
kann.
attempt in itself can already
Eine
be a form of
Die
appropriation.
Ähnlichkeit als
And
kulturtheoretisches Paradigma
if
der
you look at
Differenz
similarity
zur Seite
as a
gestellt.
cultural paradigm,
Das Verstehen des anderen ist keine Garantie für den
then
friedlichen Umgang
understanding
mit dem
the other
anderen,
doesn't.
sagt Nun ist natürlich
Bhatti
das
says if you
Unverständnis auch
understand
keine
the other,
Garantie
that
für den
doesn't mean
friedlichen
that you
Umgang
can
mit
live
dem
in peace
anderen.
or coexist.
Sozusagen
So understanding is not key
Unverständnis
here, but
zu
the
begreifen,
own
nicht zu
misunderstanding.
leugnen,
We have to understand what we
Lesern, Leserinnen
misunderstand.
einer
We
Übersetzung
mustn't
die
deny
Möglichkeit
it.
zu geben,
We
ihr eigenes
need to
Unverständnis
enable readers of a
einzufragen
translation to misunderstand the
oder es
text
eben
in their own
durch
personal
einen
way.
beigegebenen kritischen Apparat zu
And
erhellen. Und ich bin eine
maybe
sehr
we can add
große Freundin
a
dieser
specific
kritischen Apparate, die
critical
UbersetzerInnen einem
edition
Buch
in a book.
schenken und
So
habe darin schon
I'm a big
enorm
fan, a
viel
big supporter
gelernt
of
und lese
translators
sie manchmal sogar als erstes
adding
und erst
critical
dann
notes
die
for readers. I often
Übersetzung.
read those critical notes of the translators first, even before I
Das
read the
Unverständnis
translation in
kann
itself.
also einen
So
Anteil daran
misunderstanding
haben,
or
wie ich
just
übersetze.
plain not understanding
Und
can have a
sollte
part in the
letztlich
way that I
einer
translate,
guten Form
and
des Umgangs
it
dienen.
should serve a good
Ich glaube,
form
damit habe ich
of
etwa 5 Minuten
coexistence.
gesprochen.
And I think that's my 5 minutes, right?
Vielen Dank, Monika Rinck.
Thank
Wir haben
you,
ganz viele
Monika
Sachen
Rinck.
aufgegriffen,
You touched
auf die
on
wir
many
hoffentlich auch
different
gleich noch
elements
zu sprechen kommen
that
und
we would
die
love to come
Teil der
back to.
Inputs hier der beiden
They are
Kollegen
going to
sein
be
werden.
part of the
Ich möchte
inputs
dich
of the
bitten,
next of the two colleagues that we have
Salim
here,
Kürküt,
Şahin Kürküt.
deinem
I would like
Input-Referat
to ask you to read your presentation. Şahin Kürküt was born in Yarhaka. He studied philosophy in Bonn. He finished his master's degree with a focus on philosophy of language. At the same time, he trained as a teacher for Kurdish, and since 7 years he teaches Kurdish. He's actually my Kurdish teacher. I'm one of his students. And in this summer, he received a stipend for the translation of a theater book into Kurdish. And for the project Transdroste, he also translated poems into Kurdish. I think you write poems yourself, right? You translate poems, you translate plays, you work for different media, and yeah, you translate into Kurdish, or rather into Kurmanji. What is Kurdish, actually? There's South Kurdish, Kurmanji, there's different dialects, different languages. I think you're going to go into that, right? Yes. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Today we have very interesting panel questions that I have dealt with in my work of translating into Kurdish, and I'm very happy to be able to talk with you about those different aspects. But first, I want to give you some background on my input so that you understand what thoughts are behind that here. So what language are we talking about? I'm talking about the Kurdish language from the perspective of a Kurdish translator. So I asked the question, what is the relationship of the Kurdish language with translations? It's a language that has about 40 million native speakers. Those 40 million people are distributed among 4 different nation states in the order of largest to smallest. That is Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And these states can also be described as colonial powers. In all 4 countries, Kurds encounter more or less state oppression, such as bans on Kurdish language and cultural activities, assimilation, political persecution, and violence. What is known is veiled, is hidden away. What does that mean for translators? We think that we can understand a lot here, but especially when it comes to Kurdish language and translation into Kurdish, many things remain hidden away. So, about the panel question, can translation live up to the expectation of acting as a mediator between cultures? That's a beautiful romantic notion. It can be used to draw the image or metaphor of a bridge, or in the context of colonial times, the image of a ship exploring new lands and cultures and returning home with rich experiences and new horizons. Ludwig Wittgenstein said in his philosophical investigations, and I quote, "An image held us captive, and we could not escape, for it lay in our language, and it only seemed to repeat itself to us relentlessly." This sentence relates well to the images described above, or to the idea of translation as a cultural mediator. The longer we feed unilaterally on these images, the sweeter and the more harmless this one-sided contemplation of this image becomes. So, if we ask what is translation, we should rather ask, how does it work? How is it needed? And if we do that, we will recognize that translators can also be a tool of power. Translating doesn't only tear down boundaries, it also constructs new boundaries. It not only offers the new possibility of presentation, but also accelerates acculturation. Translation is not impartial or innocent. It's always about perception and interpretation of a specific worldview. and that worldview is embedded in the complex being and acting of a specific language space. That means that by translation you automatically ostracize. That starts with the choice of works that you are going to translate, but it doesn't stop there. A translator that has been socialized in a colonial state has already absorbed all that, unconsciously or consciously. So if you take away the identity of, if you make a language nameless or even mutilate it, that's also a factor of translation. An example, in the translation of Salman Rushdie's book, The Enchantress of Florence, into Turkish, the word Kurdistan was deleted by translators and interpreted differently. Terms such as Kurdish settlement areas were used. In the German translation, it says Kurdistan in German as well. Second example, in the 2004 translation of Paulo Coelho's work 11 Minutos into Turkish, words were adapted again. In German, it says Kurds come from Kurdistan, which is a region in the north of Turkey and in the south of Iraq. And in the Turkish version, it says Kurds who live in the Middle East. So the translating practice in Turkey was used to make Kurds nameless, hide them away, or even mutilate them by the verbal translation or written translation. In the Turkish parliament, there's interpreters translating into Arabic, Russian, French, and so on, but no one interprets into Turkish. So at first sight, this could be interpreted as a purely political measure. However, you can see how Kurdish is rendered nameless by the fact that Kurdish contributions or words are not recorded in the very parliamentary minutes. When someone speaks Kurdish, in the minutes it says unknown language, incomprehensible. Third example, the Kurdish epic or love drama from the 17th century, Memuzin by Emede Khani, was only translated in 2010 into Turkish. It was translated during the peace process between Turkey and the Kurds, and that peace process actually failed after 4 years. It was the first Kurdish book in history to be translated into Turkish at the behest of the Turkish Ministry of Culture. Beforehand, only a few Kurdish amateur translators had managed to translate parts of the book into Turkish. In the process, some verses were censored for political reasons. And with this hegemonic act, the Kurds were expected to just be satisfied. But the translation was a fiasco. The paradox was the following thing. A Turkish professor, not a Kurdologist, was charged with translating the epic into Turkish. An academic who interprets Kurdish as a dialect of Persian did the translation. That professor didn't know to speak Kurdish at all. Thus, for the translation, he just copied translations of others. And that is visible because typos and translation mistakes are reflected in his translation 1-to-1. Fourth example, Kurdish songs were taken over and partly declared as Turkish cultural property. The authors and singers of the original songs were made unrecognizable by using expressions such as regional song, anonymous source, or unknown source. And that practice is behind many cultural assets. So, my remarks today are only a small piece of the puzzle. Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria face similar conditions. And the Kurdish language is politically very charged. And translation cannot free itself from that. At least not easily. But translators can contribute to adjusting their work or their standard in translating in the best possible way through continuous training and international exchange. And that doesn't only include the dualism with the source text, but also with the target text. It also takes the different language regions into account.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we can see that it really also depends on how the translator is instrumentalized, whether there's a target behind the translation, or like what Ms. Rinck said, it has to be it has to be integrated in a sales process. The publishers also have to join the discussion. They might want to change something in a translation that the translator wouldn't have intended him or herself. So it's not just the political claim behind it, but it's also a matter of sales, a sales factor. I always thought that I was a translator, that I built bridges to other cultures. And now you sort of deconstruct that image in my head. Maybe even more so now with your presentation on building those bridges. Professor Johannes Salim Ismaiel-Wendt. He's professor for musical sociology and popular music studies at the University of Hildesheim. He was born in Stadtlohn, so not far from here. You're from Westphalia, from the Münsterland, born and raised here. Studied cultural sciences, sociology, and musical sciences at the University Bremen. That's also where you received your PhD from 2010 to 2012. He worked as a scientific consultant at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt Berlin in the projects translating hip-hop. Ms. Rinck also mentioned hip-hop. Maybe we can talk about that after the presentation. And global prayers. He also gives sound lectures. I'd love to hear more about that, where he combines his work as a scientist and as a musician. Ever since 2012, he's been teaching at the University of Hildesheim, and in 2013 he gave a workshop to do with the 10 years since Edward Said died. His research focus is in popular music, Musik macht Dinge, and post-colonial analysis. For the Trans-Droste project, he concepted an audio feature. We heard that yesterday with the title Heavily Laden, with the treasures from the Orient in Westphalia. And it looks at Annette von Droste-Hülshoff's project Sounds from the Orient. What are Musikmachtdinge? Is that something special? Yes, it's a term that I coined in 2016 for a book. It's sort of an extended term for musical instruments. But I don't like to call it a musical instrument, because that, for me, it sounds like instruments are just something that is an extension to our own arm. But now we have all these electronical music makers, music-making thing, and they know more about music than the people who work with them. That's why I call them Musikmachtdinge, things that you do music with, that you make music with. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yes, I'd love to get started straight away with Ferhat Tun. I interviewed him 10 years ago about his arrest in Turkey, because he sang in Kurdish, and apparently he sang in an unknown language. That was the problem. And of course, with Monika Rinck, I'd love to talk to you about hip-hop, but I wrote down 7 things, and I'm just going to read them out. They were mentioned in the last days by Özkan, by others, and maybe I'll just summarize it quickly because it has been mentioned again and again. So the first 4 things are sort of pessimistic regarding the question whether translation can be a mediator between cultures. I do not believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages. If that goes hand in hand with understanding languages as a marker for certain cultures. I don't believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages if it involves trivializing the constellations of power, colonialism, violent oppression in the context of language. I don't believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages if it goes hand in hand with thinking cultures essentialistically or ethno-culturally, as Mecheli would call it. I don't believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages if it goes hand in hand with thinking cultures rigidly and not seeing intracultural differences as at least as diverse as the differences between supposed cultures. So, yeah, that was a bit pessimistic maybe, but yeah, I was born in the Catholic Münsterland. That's what we learn here. It's normal for us. It's sort of a manifest for me. I want to look at it from a more productive perspective. Translation can be thought productively, and Monika Rinck has talked about it. If translation is perceived as a basic cultural experience, we talked about that yesterday. Also, if translation takes several categories and ways of perception in their interconnectedness, class, race, gender, religion. I don't think we talked about that enough in the last days. Able, disabled. These categories are at least as important, and we have to take them into account when it comes to building bridges. They're equally important as language. And translation can be thought productively if non-understanding or if supposed translation errors, if being translate, so being late, is seen as a creative impulse for encounter. And as part of my input, I brought a pop song along by Kyo. It's quite old, from 2007. I wrote a lot about that song. The song is called Bratwurst. And I want us to all listen to the song at least briefly, because it's an example for me for productive misunderstanding. And in the song, Kyo, a German female rapper from Germany, raps in English, in a very strange English, one could say. Kaiser Komkowski, a Norwegian musician, joins her, and Darius James, an Afro-American songwriter and poet, and they sort of take this song to deal with their cliches about German language. Let's give it a...
Zack, zack, schnell, schnell, schnell.
Jawohl, Frau General. Rocker, rocker. Rocker, rocker. Ach du lieber. Spatzi, Schätzi.
Q for Quatsch, I for Eisbein, O for Automator.
Eisbein.
Q for Quatsch, I for Eisbein, O for Automator. I've just come home to Berlin. My husband's like I'm hurling off a water shoulder.
Mein Gott, Water.
My digestion's unessential. It's depressing.
Deutsche Seele. Huh?
My digestion's unessential. Where's my Water von der Vogelweide? Potential.
Water von der Vogelweide?
America is guilty.
Ah, mein Hase.
Oh, I feel so filthy. My cultural disconnection, a permanent infection. My heritage, my image, threw it in the sewage. Zack, zack, schnell, zackig, zackig. Jawohl, schnell, schnell. I didn't emotions, you know. My Anglo brainwash cells feel happy and at home. Rakete.
V5N1.
I'm niggity nothing but a zombie, miggity molded into Gumby. Yes, I admit unhumbly, friggity Fritz's ways are bumpy. He cannot be polite, higgity, his soul is dark as night.
Zack, zack, schnell, schnell, alles Quatsch.
Haha, but they're bumpy, bumpy, bumpy.
Dein Po ist knackig. Du bist schöne Frau. Super Busen über alles.
When I found, I sent space as glue my Adidas to the ground. I'm still chaos, find myself neither disciplined nor orderly. This line should be longer, but it's growing thin. You say, I say,
Eisbein.
you say, I say,
Eisbein über alles.
I'm pushed into the stein of when like Hans and greater line until I'm gnocchi.
Eisbein über alles.
Eisbein,
Heißt im Grunde
typical German
werden
dish.
diese Klischees,
So German
verfestigt,
cliches
beziehungsweise
are
auf die
sort of
Schippe genommen.
strengthened, or actually it's a bit of a humoristic approach as well. What are we doing with that? So when does language work?
Ja, Frau Rinck, bitte.
Ms. Rinck, please.
So eigenartig, sich irgendwie aus der Ferne zu Wort zu
It's
melden
very
und
strange to
genau
join
weiß,
you
was
from
ich wirklich
afar
sagen will.
because I never even know if you can hear me. Yes, we can hear you, we can see you.
Ich denke, es ist auch wichtig zu
I think it is
unterscheiden, ob ich es
important
mit
to
einer
make to
ästhetischen
differentiate
Übersetzung
between
zu
an
tun habe,
aesthetic
der in sich
translation
sozusagen Irritationsverstörung,
where
Mehrdeutigkeit genießen kann,
irritation can be
oder
something
eben
that
einem
we
anderen
enjoy or
Text,
ambiguity,
Gebrauchstext und
or whether
möglicherweise
we
sogar
look at a
einem
different sort of text, like
Gerichtsprotokoll,
maybe
wo
a
es dann
legal
sozusagen,
text, a
also das
protocol,
wollte ich noch
a court
nachfragen,
protocol,
sozusagen dieses Umarmen des
because to
Unverständnisses
embrace the
ist
things
etwas,
we don't
was in
understand,
einem
that is
ästhetischen
something that, yes, in
Zusammenhang
an
oder in einem
aesthetic
Zusammenhang,
context
wo
can make
Leute
sense, or
miteinander umgehen,
in a
das auch
context
gleichzeitig als
where
spielerisch begreifen
people
kann,
sort of
natürlich eine
understand it
andere
as a
Sache,
game, as
als
something playful. That's very different
wenn ich
from other
offenkundige
situations when it's
Übersetzungsfehler
really
mir begegnen,
about
die dann in
transferring
Asylverfahren
information,
einen direkten
you know, things that can have an
Einfluss haben auf das
impact
Schicksal einer Person.
on the life of people, like in asylum
Da wollte ich
cases
vielleicht
in
ganz
front of the
kurz
court.
noch auf ein Projekt
And
hinweisen, dass
that is
das,
why I wanted to mention a
literarisch-deutsch-arabische,
project that's the literal
Literaturkollektiv Devise
German
gerade,
Arabic cultural archive Devise,
versucht, das
and that
Literaturkollektiv
is
Devise den Al-Khatib-Prozess in Koblenz,
they
der
try
auf
to
dem
follow
Weltrechtsprinzip basiert.
the Al-Khatib
Das
trial in
2002 zum
Koblenz,
ersten Mal in
a
Deutschland in
trial
Kraft
against
trat,
alleged perpetrators
wo
suspected of
es
so-called
eben, wo man
state torture in
Verbrechen,
Syria,
schwerste Verbrechen, Völkermord
and
und
yes,
Kriegsverbrechen eben an unterschiedlichen Orten
crimes like genocide can now be brought to court
dort wird
in
gerade
different
gegen einen
places.
Verdächtigen der
And
syrischen
at the
Staatsfolter
moment, there is a case
prozessiert.
against,
Und
one
es
of
gibt aber
an alleged
teilweise
perpetrator.
kein-
But
Es gibt die Fragen zum Beispiel der
the
Richterin
questions of
werden
the
übersetzt, aber die arabische Übersetzung ist selten zu hören. Und deswegen
of the
fällt jeweils
judge, they are
ein
translated,
arabisches und ein deutschsprachiges Mitglied
and
der
there's
Regie
usually
schreiben
an Arabic and a
wird. Und das ist
German
sozusagen die
translator,
einzige
and they
Mitschrift,
take
die es
notes.
auch
But that's
sozusagen
the
in beiden
only
Sprachen
protocol
gibt,
that exists in both
weil es keine
languages,
zweisprachigen Protokolle
because
gibt
there are
dort
no
in Koblenz. Und
bilingual protocollants
haben mir
in
auch berichtet,
Koblenz.
dass es,
And what I heard, what
natürlich,
they
wenn ich
told
einen
me is that
nordafrikanischen
if you
Übersetzer
have
habe, der syrisches
a
Arabisch
translator
übersetzt
from
hat, wird
Northern
er
Africa
Schwierigkeiten
who
haben.
translates
Und all
Syrian
diese
Arabic, then
Fragen
he will
kann
have
sich eigentlich gar nicht klar
difficulties.
machen,
And
was
all
mit
those
dem
questions that maybe
nennt
people don't even are aware of and that have to do with the political principle of a world right principle. They go hand in hand in that, with that. And how can we as translators make sure that we find the truth in the end? And yes, we have to distinguish that from trying to reconstruct aesthetic misunderstandings in an enjoyable way. So that would be translating at courts. We are talking about translation in general, literature translation, what you also worked with. But nonetheless, I would like to ask you to maybe just talk to us about your project. It has to do with translating and interpreting at a court case, and you talk about how that can lead to problems and lack of dignity.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. That is eminently important. It's not as it was in the song we heard, everything is circus and can just break down at one more point in time, it doesn't matter. What you pointed out reminds me of a project where we work with an audio collective that's called ARC, and in 2017 I participated in the trial of the NSU, the right-wing terror group in Germany, and I declared myself an expert because I looked at the use of microphones within that trial, and I looked at how is the translation being taken care of, who needs to wear a headset, who hears the original witness in their original language, who hears the interpretation. That is quite important in this case. And what were the mistakes that happened there? So I watched the trial, I looked at the first 350 protocols, I searched the protocols for segments where a microphone was used, where it was about language. So there's a judge, for example, and the judge has a switchboard, and that judge can switch microphones on and off. And there's about 80 microphones in that hall. So there's many microphones, but the translator and the witness need to share a microphone. And the audience members in the gallery, for example, can't hear what the witness says because you only hear the translation over the loudspeakers. So that was fascinating to see. And in that case, that translation and the way it was implemented was very politically Latin. That's just an example. That reminds me of a Turkish light culture, a Turkish dominant culture that goes against Kurdish. You translate into Kurdish. Could you tell us about how you personally and your network of translators, how you work? Kurdish, you said, is a language that is not being taken care of because it's forbidden in the national states where Kurds live. So what do you do? What can you do? Is it just translating plays? Is that maybe a beginning? Well, here we can't really do much. We don't have a real network. We are still responsible for our families who still live in Kurdistan. And that is very important. I was not able to get proper training here on how to translate into Kurdish. I was not able to get proper training on how to teach Kurdish. Those possibilities didn't exist. Like learning that at university, that's not possible. In Kurdistan, it's forbidden, and here it's not possible. Not that much has happened here, even though there's 1.3 million Kurds living in this country. So we don't really have the institutions. We don't have an institutional basis for the Kurdish language here. everyone does what they can, and that's it. But there is this publishing house that was founded in Diyarbakir, and they translate literature from many languages into Kurdish. So there are attempts to support, to strengthen Kurmanji. Sorani is a bit stronger anyway, as I understand it, because Sorani is, there's more translations into Sorani and there's more Kurds writing in Sorani, right? Yes. There in South Kurdistan, we have a state structure, really. Sorani is an official language there, and so there's a lot of support for Sorani, but for Kurmanji, that doesn't exist. And maybe about your question, what is Kurmanji? Why do we call it that? Kurmanji and Sorani are the two big dialects of Kurdish. We also call it North Kurdish, that's Kurmanji, and Sorani is South Kurdish. There's also a dialect, or it's Middle Kurdish, and there's also a dialect, a group of dialects that are considered South Kurdish. There is another dialect, but that's a bit disputed. Many say this is not a dialect, this is its own language. So there's 4 big groups of dialects, and 60% of Kurdish-speaking people speak Kurmanji in 4 parts of Kurdistan. So that was maybe just a short overview. So there's not a lot of Kurmanji literature, there's very few translations into Kurmanji, so there's many languages that were not translated or that is not translated into, and those decisions are political decisions, and that is also visible when we look at the list of Nobel laureates for literature. There's one person who received the Nobel Prize for literature who was Arabic speaking, that was in 1987. And that's the only Nobel Prize for an Arabic speaker, even though there's many Arabic authors. And the 100 best books as selected by Dennis Scheck, there's 1001 Nights is in there, Dubran Khalil is in there, it's a Lebanese who emigrated to the USA and writes in English. There's not a single Arabic language author on there, there's not a single Turkish language author, and of course, no Kurdish language author. How can we, and that question goes to you as well, Ms. Rinck, because you deal with language so much, how can we change this? How can we move the majority of society to be more sensitive when it comes to those decisions? When someone is chosen for a Nobel Prize for Literature, this year it was Gurna, but he writes in English. So how can we actually raise awareness for the majority of society that there is a world of literature that we just don't know? And the fact that there's no awards being handed out to authors in that language doesn't mean that that language, that that literature doesn't exist. What can we do here? That's a very difficult question. I often say that untranslatability is a societal or a money problem, not a lexical problem. Often it's about, can you even translate this poem? Oh, do you even have a word for that? How would you say Gemütlichkeit in English? That to me is just folklore. The problem is a lot deeper. How do I get to know something that I don't know, that it exists? There are people who have that knowledge, who can pass that knowledge on, and they need to be more present. So the public is being diversified there at the moment. At the same time, there's a lot of defense against those new developments. There are processes that have many conflicts within them. I would say be more careful about who can we ask about this. Taking care of that and then really asking. I don't know if the International Festival even has a future, but for many international festivals, it's always the same people who are there. It's always the same people from different countries. It's often poets, it's often three poets, often three male poets from the African continent that are invited again and again and again. They are already translated, they are known, and they are invited. But if you actually pay attention here, if you want to reflect the international scene, and then you always only invite a very small part of that international scene, then yeah, that doesn't really change anything. I always try to pay attention here. I always try to tell people about it. When I have found texts, authors, books, for example, where I think so many more people need to know this exists, and I hope that that is then passed on. This afternoon, we had a panel, and there we talked about 1001 Nights, and the colleague who translated Droste into Persian said that he believes that Droste read 1001 Nights. I think she probably read 1001 Nights and not the Divan, but maybe she read both. But the cliches from 1001 Nights are cliches, are stereotypes that we translators who translate into Arabic, those cliches are still influencing us today. We still have the impression that we need to fight against those cliches, be it the cover of a book, be it critiques of books. Critiques often mention 1001 Night, even though the entire book has nothing to do with it, even if it's a modern novel, for example. You deal with colonialism and post-colonialism. What would you say? What would be your proposal? How can we raise awareness? How can we teach people that everything Arabic isn't 1001 Night, even if it's still read to children? That still happens, but it's not a depiction, it's not a representation of Arabic literature. I don't have a real answer to that, but I would like to ask a question. What would the real Arabic literature be? And can we imagine that literature without Goethe, without Rinck, without Droste if you like? That is something that just came to me when you said this is an African author, but he writes in English. I think we need to accept, we definitely need to accept today that this is their family language. It is their mother tongue. That is part of all this. And a person from India once told me, what, cricket isn't an English sport? Look at how bad they are at it. The only ones who are as good as we is Jamaica. So that colonial history that is interconnected with that sport, and that is something that the formerly colonized appropriated for themselves, and now they act on it independently. And I think that is something that we need to accept. If someone from Africa writes in English, then that person very probably writes in their favorite language. They write in the language they want to express their thoughts in. I just want to point out one thing, and I also tried to say that in my statement. We mustn't connect languages with specific cultures. We must accept that there's different phases of globalizations, as Ottmar Etter said the day before yesterday, and that just accumulated over time. And I believe that we also need to take the step to recognize the following thing. Yesterday we talked about stable identities. That didn't sit well with me. I think it has become clear that we all don't have only one single identity. And it's not a problem if you feel you're a part of different cultures. You can be Turkish and Kurdish and German at the same time, or Palestinian and German at the same time. Gunnar lives in England, so it's his literary language, you're right. But I think we need to liberate ourselves from that understanding that person comes from that country, that's his language, and he's going to write in that language. We need to disconnect ourselves from that, and we need to maybe bring that into our literary work. Unfortunately, it's already 6:30, and we need to stop in time today. So, do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for these wonderful inputs. It was very enriching. It was lovely listening to you. And each input, for me as a literature scientist, was very rewarding for me. I don't really have a question. I just kind of want to emphasize a couple of things from my perspective. Şahin, when you talk about Kurmanji, the Kurdish language, when you talk about the situation in Turkey, and you're asked about what we can do, then my impulse from the audience was to get in there right now, because especially when it comes to this topic, we are not individuals. We have to act together, and you said that. And we need networks. We need to stand side by side. As somebody who is in that system, in the diaspora of the Turkish system, who's moving in that system, and who, of course, publicly wants to cooperate with you. But I think that that's a question that kind of hands over responsibility to the individual. And I don't want to say that we have no power, but I do want to emphasize that we have to make sure it's not on us alone. We can translate and we can form networks, but you pointed out, and right so, that it's not the case that you, even if you had the money, to do that, if you would want to spread the word, if you want to speak out about Kurdistan, that you can't do it because you are responsible for your family who is there, and they might be the ones to suffer the consequences. So all of this goes hand in hand with translation, and we are very far away from it. When I talk about the rights or the obligations of this country when it comes to the heritage of Turkish life in Germany, I now always try to integrate the Kurdish perspective. I try to say Turkish and Kurdish, but this also brings a certain risk, because me, as somebody from Turkey, I would then speak about the Kurdish life, and that is a bit risky. So if we show solidarity, if we stand by side, then that's a risk, but it also enables us to start a dialogue. What you also emphasized is that we have to focus more on dialogue. We have to talk about things. We have to ask directly. We have to be present. And as somebody who's originally from Turkey, I feel obliged to not just talk about Baykut, but to also talk about his opinion on the Kurdish question, to talk about these issues, and all that is highly political. And publishing houses still have a lot to do when it comes to opening up and saying, okay, let's focus on Kurdish diaspora literature. Let's stand up against what is happening in Turkey in the political sphere that when it comes to the Kurdish, but it is also something that we have to focus on here in Germany, in the community, because there's not enough support. Usually here when we talk about Turkish life in Germany, well, we do also have to talk about Kurdish life. It's not as much a question, it's more of a feedback. I would like to thank all of you for this very interesting panel. I'm going to take so much away from that. Thank you very much. I think translation is not going to solve our problems. In order to fulfill that task, we need other tools and we need more time. But I think that this project, our project here, achieves so much. All of us are sitting here now in Drost's living room. We're sitting here together. We talk about translation. We talk about the Kurdish language. And I think not regarding content, but as a translation can achieve so much. That's wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Monika. Rinck. Was so interesting listening to you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And yes, I would also like to thank everybody who helped us organize this event. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.